woman didn't even finish her coffee. She looked at him once, really looked, the way people do when they're deciding whether someone is worth their time. And then she reached for her coat. That was it. No scene, no raised voice. Just a quiet, devastating assessment, the kind that lands harder than anything shouted across a room. Audrey Sinclair had spent 15 years building a reputation for reading people quickly. She would have said it was a skill. Callum, the man sitting across from her, hands wrapped around a mug he hadn't touched either, would later say he never blamed her for it. That was the part that stayed with people when the story came out. Not the cars, not the revelation, the fact that he never blamed her. It had started the way a lot of things start in Kelowna, with someone trying to be helpful. Audrey's colleague at the firm, a well-meaning woman named Dana, had been pushing the idea for months. You work too hard. You eat lunch at your desk. You haven't been on a date since. When? Before the pandemic? Audrey always deflected with the same response. She was fine, she was busy, she didn't need anyone to arrange her personal life like it was a calendar event. But Dana was persistent in the particular way that only genuinely kind people can be, and eventually, Audrey ran out of reasons to say no. The man Dana had in mind was someone her husband knew from the Okanagan business community. Mid-40s, Dana said. Quiet. Decent. She didn't say much else, which Audrey later realized was intentional. They'd agreed on a Saturday morning, a cafe in the South Pandosi neighborhood, the kind of place with exposed brick and jazz playing just low enough that you could ignore it. Audrey arrived 7 minutes early, which she always did, and took a corner table facing the door. She noticed the parking lot before she noticed him. There were 3 vehicles that did not belong in that lot. She wasn't someone who followed the automotive world closely, but you didn't need to be an enthusiast to understand what you were looking at, the kind of machines that drew second glances from people who didn't know what they were, not because of logos or badges, but because of the way they sat on the ground, like they were coiled. A pale gray one she didn't recognize, a matte black one, and then the blue one near the end of the row, which even she could identify as something extraordinary, mostly because of the way a man in a paint-speckled hoodie was walking past it without looking at it twice. She watched the man in the hoodie push open the cafe door. He was tall, lean in the way that suggested he used his body for actual work rather than a gym membership. His hair needed cutting. He was wearing a jacket that had seen better decades, and his boots were the kind you buy once and wear for 15 years. He scanned the room without urgency, found her table, and walked over with the easy, unhurried movement of someone who had never once in his life been worried about making an impression. "Audrey," he said. "That's me," she said. He sat down. His name was Callum Ward. He told her he was from just outside of Oliver, originally, though he'd been in the valley his whole adult life. He had a daughter, 8 years old. He said her name was Piper and that she was currently at her grandmother's place, which was the only reason he'd been able to get out of the house by 10 on a Saturday morning. He smiled when he said it. Not a performed smile, the kind that happens because a thought genuinely lands somewhere warm inside you. Audrey smiled back, because it would have been rude not to. But she was already doing the mental math that she was not particularly proud of doing, the kind that had kept her efficient and solvent for her entire career. She ran risk assessments for commercial real estate developments. It was a job that had trained her to evaluate everything quickly and move on if the fundamentals didn't hold. The fundamentals, as she was reading them, were single father, rural background, jacket from a decade ago, no business card offered, no watch, no obvious markers of the kind of professional life she had assumed Dana's husband would orbit. Dana's husband was a civil engineer. The people he knew were presumably similar. This man looked like he worked with his hands. There was nothing wrong with that. She told herself there was nothing wrong with that. But there was a version of her future she had been quietly constructing since her divorce 4 years ago, and it had specific load-bearing walls. And this did not feel like a conversation that was going to support any of them. She asked what he did. He said he ran a small operation, automotive mostly. He said it the way you describe something that didn't require further explanation, not falsely modest, just efficient. Like the question was a formality he was happy to answer once. She nodded. She asked a few more questions. He answered them without elaborating. He asked her about her work, and she told him, and he listened in the way that some people do where you can tell they're actually filing the information rather than just waiting for their turn to speak. That part she noticed. She gave him credit for it internally even as she was calculating her exit. The thing that pushed her over the edge, she would later admit to herself, was not anything he said. It was what someone else said. A man she recognized, not well, just from a Chamber of Commerce event 2 years ago, spotted Callum from across the room and came over. His name was Peter, and he was the kind of person who filled silence like it was a vacancy to be occupied. He clapped Callum on the shoulder with the practiced heartiness of a man who considered himself universally light. "Ward," he said, grinning, "haven't seen you in ages. Still keeping the old rigs running?" "Here and there," Callum said. Peter turned to Audrey. "This guy. Don't let him fool you. Best mechanic in the South Okanagan. Hands like a surgeon." He laughed at his own observation. "You'd never know to look at him, right?" He moved on before anyone could respond, just dropped the description like a stone and walked away. Audrey looked at Callum. He was watching her, not defensively, just watching, like he knew exactly what was happening in her head and had decided not to intervene. She looked down at her coffee cup. She thought about Dana's cheerful certainty that this would be good for her. She thought about the 15-minute drive she'd taken across town. She thought about the way she'd stood in front of her closet for 20 minutes that morning, deciding what to wear to a first date that was now resolving itself in real time into something that made her feel vaguely embarrassed, though she could not have immediately said for whom. She reached for her coat. "I'm sorry," she said. "I don't think this is going to work." She said it quietly. She was not cruel about it. She prided herself on that after. She didn't make a speech. She didn't explain herself. She just stood, pulled her coat on, and said she hoped he had a good rest of his weekend. Callum Ward said, "Thanks for coming out." That was it. No argument. No visible wound. He picked up his coffee mug and took a sip like she had simply stepped away to use the restroom and would be back in a moment. She walked out. The bell above the door made its small sound behind her. She was in her car and halfway out of the parking space when she saw the men. 3 of them, standing near the vehicle she'd noticed earlier, not passers-by. They were standing deliberately, the way people stand when something belongs to them. One of them had a cloth in his hand. He was wiping down the rear quarter panel of the gray one, not the way a valet wipes down a car, but the way an owner does, slowly, attentively, the way you touch something you built a relationship with. Audrey sat with her car in reverse, foot on the brake. A 4th man came out of the cafe behind her. She saw him in her rearview mirror. He was speaking to one of the 3 men near the cars, and the man with the cloth turned and nodded, and then all 4 of them moved in the unhurried way of people who are exactly where they're supposed to be. The 4th man was Callum Ward. He said something. One of the others laughed. He pulled out a key, not the kind you get from a valet, but a slim, understated key fob, and the lights on the blue car blinked once. Audrey sat there. She did not know precisely what she was looking at in dollar terms. She found out later, the way everyone finds out things these days, which was to say, her friend texted her a link at 11:30 that night after Audrey had, against her better judgment, described the afternoon out loud. The link was to an article about a private automotive investment group based in the Okanagan that had spent the past decade quietly acquiring and restoring rare performance vehicles and then lending them to charitable auction events across BC and Alberta. The group was not widely publicized. Its principal, the article noted near the bottom, in the understated way of profiles that are not written for people who need to be impressed, was a man named Callum Ward who had started the operation from a single garage outside of Oliver at the age of 26. He had a daughter. He lived in the valley. He did not own a business card as far as anyone could tell. He also, by the time Audrey read the article with her phone balanced on her knee in her dark living room, apparently owned or had significant interest in 6 of the most unusual automobiles in the interior of British Columbia. She sat with that for a long time. She thought about the key fob blinking once in the afternoon light. She thought about what Peter had said, best mechanic in the South Okanagan, and the way Callum had not corrected him, had not offered a single word of clarification or self-promotion in the 10 seconds between the comment and Peter walking away. She thought about what she'd said, "I don't think this is going to work," and the way he'd said thanks for coming out, like she'd done him a small favor that he was genuinely grateful for. What Audrey didn't know, because she left before she could, was what happened in the cafe after the door closed behind her. Callum sat with his coffee for another few minutes. He wasn't thinking about her, specifically. He was thinking about the fact that Piper had asked him that morning, while he was putting on his jacket, whether his friend Dana's friend was nice. He'd said he didn't know yet. He was about to find out. Piper had considered this, and then asked whether he'd be home for lunch. He said he probably would. She had nodded and turned back to her book, which was a novel about a girl who discovers her grandmother is secretly a retired astronaut, in which she had already read twice. That was Piper. She reread things she loved rather than moving on. Callum had always thought there was something solid about that, like she understood that good things were worth returning to. He thought about her while he drank his coffee. He was not heartbroken. He wasn't even particularly surprised. He'd been on enough of these arranged introductions over the past 2 years. Dana wasn't the first well-meaning person to try to understand that there was a version of him that was visible in a first meeting, and a version that wasn't, and that the visible version gave certain people a very specific read. He had stopped explaining himself somewhere around the time Piper turned 5, which was about a year after her mother left and about 2 years after he'd stopped needing external confirmation that he knew what he was doing. He left a tip that was larger than the bill. He always did this, not for any reason he could have easily articulated, just because servers worked hard, and because he'd spent a year waiting tables himself when he was 22 and had never forgotten the arithmetic of it. He pushed open the door and walked out into the September light. "The gray one's pulling to the right," said a man named Thomas, who had worked with Callum for 11 years and had the particular loyalty of someone who had seen the whole arc of the thing from almost the beginning. "I want to get it on the lift before the auction next weekend. I want to get it on the lift before the auction next weekend." "Book it for Tuesday," Callum said. "Already did." They stood in the parking lot for a few minutes talking about logistics. The blue car was going to a fundraiser in Penticton. The matte black one had a new owner, a collector outside of Calgary, who was arranging transport. The gray one needed the alignment and possibly the brake lines looked at before it went anywhere. Callum listened and gave answers and didn't think about the woman who had walked out, because there was nothing useful to think. People made assessments. He'd made plenty of his own over the years, some of which he'd been wrong about and some of which he'd been right about. And the only consistent thing he'd learned was that the people who needed you to prove yourself up front were rarely the ones worth proving yourself to. He got in his truck, an old one, a Tacoma with 200,000 kilometers on it that he had rebuilt twice and had no intention of replacing, and drove to his mother's house to pick up Piper. She was in the backyard when he arrived, helping her grandmother weed a garden bed. She had dirt on her knees and a serious expression that she always wore when she was doing something she decided was important. "How was the coffee?" she asked when she saw him. "Good coffee," he said. She studied him for a moment with the particular perceptiveness of a child who has learned to read her parents' tone rather than his words. "Was she nice?" "She was polite," he said. Piper accepted this. She turned back to the garden bed and pulled a weed with focused determination. "Grandma says you don't need anyone who can't see you." Callum looked over at his mother, who was very carefully not looking at him. "Grandma's a wise person," he said. "I know," Piper said. "I told her that." He didn't think about Audrey Sinclair again for 3 weeks. When he did, it was because she called. He almost didn't answer. The number wasn't in his contacts, but he'd grown up in a small enough world that unknown local numbers usually turned out to be someone he knew, or someone who needed something, and both were worth a minute. "This is going to sound strange," she said when he picked up. He waited. "I looked up your work," she said, "after. I should say, I don't make a habit of calling people I've met once and then left without finishing my coffee, so I want you to know that this is somewhat outside my normal behavior." "Okay," he said. "I was rude," she said, "not theatrically rude, but I made a judgment that I would not have made if I'd had different information, and I think that's worth acknowledging." He was quiet for a moment. He was standing in his garage, which smelled like motor oil and the particular cold of a September evening beginning to tip toward October. There was a Porsche on the lift, not one of his, a client's car, a 996 with an oil leak that had been annoying its owner for 6 months, and the shop light was casting a yellow cone over everything. "You don't owe me anything," he said, genuinely. I know, she said. That's not why I'm calling. He waited again. I'm calling because I think I'd like to try that coffee again, she said. If you're open to it. And I want to be honest that I don't fully understand my own reasoning, except that I think there's something I walked out on, that I haven't been able to stop thinking about. And I'm 41 years old, and I've learned to pay attention when that happens. He looked at the Porsche on the lift. He thought about Piper pulling weeds with the focused expression of someone engaged in genuinely important work. He thought about his mother not looking at him. I'm around Thursday evenings, he said. Thursday works, she said. Same cafe, he said. A pause. Different one, she said, if you don't mind. I don't mind, he said. He could hear something settle in her voice when he said it. Not relief, exactly. More like the sound of someone who has been braced for something and then found they didn't need to be. They met on a Thursday in October when the valley was doing the thing it does in fall, all copper and amber, and that particular low-angle light that makes everything look like it's been slightly gilded. The cafe she chose was a smaller one, tucked off Bernard Avenue, with a wood stove going in the corner and tables that had mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu that changed daily. She was there first this time. She stood when he came in, which surprised him. Hi, she said. Hi, he said. They sat down. The server brought the menus neither of them needed and then came back and took their order and then left them alone. Audrey looked at him across the table. She looked like someone who had prepared what she was going to say and then decided in the last moment not to say it. Tell me about Piper, she said instead. He looked up. She was watching him with an expression that was careful and open at the same time, like a door that had been pulled off its hinges and leaned against the frame, not hung, but at least no longer blocking the way. He told her about Piper. He talked about the way she reread books she loved. He talked about the grandmother's garden and the focused expression. He talked about the astronaut novel. He talked about Piper's very serious opinion that the school cafeteria's approach to pizza was fundamentally misguided and that she intended to write a letter about it, which she had actually done, in pencil, in her best handwriting, and mailed through the actual postal system because she felt that email lacked appropriate formality for the gravity of the issue. Audrey laughed, not politely, actually laughed, the kind that comes up from somewhere unexpected. Did the school respond? She asked. A form letter, he said, which she found deeply unsatisfying. I imagine she did. They talked for 2 hours. He paid the bill and she let him. And then outside on the sidewalk in the October cold, she looked at him and said she was sorry again, more specifically this time, and he told her she didn't have to keep doing that. I know, she said, but I want to. He nodded. Your colleague's description of you wasn't wrong, she said, the mechanic part, but it wasn't the whole picture. Most descriptions aren't, he said. I should have waited for more of the picture. He looked down the street. A couple was walking a dog that was wearing a small jacket against the cold, and the dog had the expression of a creature deeply committed to the task of the walk. He watched it for a moment. I run a business that most people in this valley have never heard of, he said. That's not an accident. I spent a long time figuring out what kind of life I actually wanted, and it turned out not to be the kind that needs a lot of external confirmation. Piper knows what I do. The people I work with know. My mother knows. He looked back at her. Anyone who decides what I'm worth in the first 5 minutes isn't missing anything I owe them. She was quiet. But I'm also not interested in holding that morning against you for the rest of the time we know each other, he said. If that ends up being a long time, which it might. She looked at him. Might, she said. Might, he agreed. She smiled. It was a different smile from the polished professional expression she'd worn in the first cafe 3 weeks ago. It was smaller and more real, the kind that doesn't have anywhere to be. They walked to the end of the block and stood on the corner while she waited for her rideshare, and he stood with his hands in his jacket pockets, and the light changed twice, and neither of them said much, and it wasn't uncomfortable. Before her car came, she asked him something she'd been turning over since she first read the article 3 weeks ago. The auction fundraisers, she said, the cars you lend, what causes? He considered the question briefly like he was deciding how much to say. Children's hospitals, he said, mostly. There's a literacy program in the north end of the city we've been supporting for the last 3 years. A couple of others. She nodded slowly. You don't advertise any of that, she said. No. Why not? He was quiet for a moment. A light went off in the cafe behind them. Someone inside was stacking chairs. Because it's not for the advertising, he said. Her rideshare pulled up. She reached for the door handle and then paused. Piper's led her to the cafeteria, she said, the one in her best handwriting. Yes. Does she know you kept it? He smiled, just briefly. The same warm internal thing she'd seen in the first cafe and attributed to a nice but ultimately irrelevant quality. She will, he said, when she's older. She got in the car. She looked at him through the window as the car pulled away, and he raised one hand slightly in acknowledgement, and then he turned and walked back to where his truck was parked around the corner. He got in. He sat for a moment. He thought about Piper's question from 3 weeks ago. Was she nice? And the answer he'd given. She was polite. He thought he might have to revise that. He started the truck and drove home through the gilded October valley, and the evening felt like the particular kind of beginning that you only recognize as such later, when you're looking back at it with the full weight of what came after. He drove past the old garage on the edge of town where it had all started. The one building, the one lift, the idea that had been too stubborn to stay small. The lights were off. It was late, but he could picture it lit up the way it used to be, at 2 in the morning when he was 26, and certain of nothing except the work. He thought about Piper. He thought about Thursday evenings. He thought that sometimes the thing you built, quietly, over years, without announcement, turns out to be exactly visible enough to exactly the right person at exactly the right time. He drove home through the dark. I keep coming back to that moment in the parking lot. Audrey, halfway out of her space, foot on the brake, watching Callum walk toward those cars like he owned the ground under them. Because he did. And I think about what it cost her to make that call. Not the embarrassment, not even the missed connection. What it cost her was the 3 weeks she spent sitting with the weight of a decision she couldn't unmake, reading an article on her phone in a dark living room, understanding for the first time that she'd used the wrong measuring tape. We all have one. A measuring tape we picked up somewhere along the way. From the jobs we wanted, the circles we moved through, the version of success we decided counted. Audrey's told her that worn boots and an old jacket meant something specific. It was efficient, that tape. It had probably served her well in conference rooms and due diligence meetings. The problem was, she brought it to a cafe on a Saturday morning and used it on a person. What I find myself thinking about is Callum's side of it. He never corrected Peter, never said a word when the description landed. Fast mechanic in the South Okanagan, and Audrey's expression shifted. He just sat there and let her decide. And I think that took something. Not indifference, and not pride either. Something more like a settled understanding of who he was that didn't require her participation to stay intact. That kind of groundedness doesn't happen by accident. It gets built, quietly, over years of choosing the work over the announcement, the action over the credit, the daughter over the impression. There's something I've learned about integrity, not as a concept, but as a daily practice, which is that it mostly looks like nothing from the outside. Callum lending cars to children's hospital fundraisers and not advertising it. Piper mailing a handwritten letter about cafeteria pizza because she believed the issue deserved the formality. These aren't grand gestures. They're just people doing what they think is right when no one's watching, because that's the kind of person they decided to be. And then there's the matter of Audrey calling him 3 weeks later. That took something too. Not a small thing. It's genuinely hard to pick up a phone and say I was wrong to someone you walked out on, especially when walking out felt so clean and logical at the time. But she did it, and I think that matters as much as anything else in this story. Maybe more. Because the willingness to look at yourself clearly, to say I used the wrong measure, to try again without any guarantee it works out, that's its own kind of strength. The quiet kind, the kind that doesn't announce itself. I think about Piper asking her father if the woman was nice, and Callum saying she was polite, and what it meant that he was willing, by the end of it, to revise that answer. He drove home through an October valley thinking that it might be a beginning. Not certain. Just open to it. That's what stays with me, not the cars, not the reveal, just two people doing the harder thing, One by not defending himself when it would have been easy, one by reaching back when it would have been easier to let it go, and finding, somewhere in the middle of all that ordinary difficulty, that there might be something worth showing up for. That's usually how it works, I think. Quietly, without announcement. In October light, over coffee that actually gets finished this time.